Chris, if I could, let me get you to introduce yourself, and I'm going to just ask you some questions as we go through. I think you have a lot that can help steer some of the conversation that our class is going to have this week in concerning kids that have had some type of adverse event in their life.
Yeah, thank you, John. Name's Christopher Freeze. I go by Chris, and I'm currently the director of training for Hope Rising Mississippi.
Yeah. So I think one of the cool things is what you're doing now. And so I know that you are currently pursuing your doctorate degree, and I know you haven't sort of nailed down everything with your dissertation, but give us an idea of where you're sort of working right now and where you are.
Yeah, I retired from the FBI a couple of years ago after working for them for 23 years, and was basically sitting on my couch drinking coffee when I had an opportunity to come to Oklahoma University in Tulsa and work with Dr. Chen Hellman, who is the head of the Hope Research Center and sort of behind the current movement to discuss the science of hope. And so what I've been doing here, trying to get ready for my dissertation, is to do work as much as possible around the idea of trauma, trust, and hope, right? Sort of that intersection of all three of those ideas and how those affect an individual and play out in an individual's life.
I think one of the things for those of us who have been in psychology realms and social work realms and education, we're very familiar with the ACEs study about what it is. We're very familiar about the idea of the adverse events and that they do produce problems later on in life. I think that from what I have seen, there really is little research in between them. We know that it happens, we know that it's out there, but we're not sure of those factors. Is this what you're finding as well?
Yeah, and I'm kind of jealous of those of you that have the psychology, sociology background, social work background, because I came from law enforcement. I was an accountant, right? So the whole idea of trauma and anything else that is part of life's experiences, I obviously saw it in my job, but it really didn't occur to me as to what the real root cause was, or really how to address it. And so after some events took place later in my career, not long before I retired, I'm starting to look into trauma, and it was great. I mean, it was an understanding, it was an awakening of some of the issues, and I learned about the ACE study and some of that. But I guess it's my opinion, people would differ with me, but as I delved into it further, I was really struck by the idea that I'm not sure there's a good framework for how to address it. It seemed like everybody's talking about it, and there's a need to understand it, which is great. But it's at the end of the day, it sort of comes down to the idea of, well, we just need to understand trauma affects people and be nicer to them and try not to re-traumatize them and go from there. And it's like, well, it sort of seems a little, short on specifics. Yeah. And so that's when I heard, Dr. Hellman and his work around the science of hope and the framework of hope. And it's like, for me, and I think for a lot of us, but for me particularly, it's like, that's a way of thinking. That's a concept, a framework that I can actually use to help somebody who has experienced adversities and trauma. And it's actually something that, I can give to them, this, simple but not simplistic way of looking at the challenges and trying to help them address. And so that's what I'm doing now. But I agree with you, John. I know there's a lot of literature out there, particularly in the education field. They've been doing more, and obviously in the physical and mental health, you'll find writings about the effects of trauma and the outcomes. But there's not a lot. And again, it may be growing some. There's just not a lot on, okay, how do you actually address this trauma in a meaningful way?
Yeah. So when we talk about that, and I think also when we mention to talk about the ACEs, we are talking about trauma that happens specifically at younger ages. Mm-hmm. And while we know that trauma also has lasting effect at any age, there is some specific things that happen for younger age. And so what are some of the effects that we see for kids that are in traumatic events?
Well, I really appreciate the work that Dr. Bruce Perry has done in this area. And that's where I was learning about the idea that, those first couple of months of a child's life really are frankly, the most important. And
Yeah,
so
perinatal.
if that child is getting accustomed to experiencing adverse effects, then the brain is going to expect that and prune away all the things that might actually be good and just kind of reinforce that negativity and that adversity. And I think you see that play out a lot from my perspective in, kids who have trouble with school, kids who find themselves engaging, encountering, I guess, the juvenile justice system. Certainly not to their fault, but, you see a lot of this obviously in kids who are in foster care, and a lot of just the behavioral aspects of it that, when people come dysregulated and the depression, anxiety, that I think we see this manifest in many ways. And unless you are willing to look and ask the questions, I think we look at it and treat it like, well, I can just fix that problem and, medicate it and be fine. But we're really not getting to the root cause. And so that's how I see it play out.
Well, and I know some of the statistics, like if first off, being in foster care by itself, I think means in a very generic, and I recognize that this is a generalization, but they're estimating around 4.7 adverse events, is like the average or the median for those in foster care. Well, and if you are, according to the ACEs study, if you have in that range, anything 4+, it's like 300% higher likelihood of depression. It's 700% more likely to abuse or have some type of substance abuse issue on there. And we're seeing this happen in the adolescent realm as well. So I think the interest that I have found growing into this field is, what do we do when those intersect? So all of a sudden we have this trajectory of kids that have had a backstory of trauma, and all of a sudden we have really ignored it up to this point, or at least only tolerated it, and then they get into the adolescent realm, and then we find them on the streets, increased criminality behavior, lower school performance, more cross inside the school behavioral issues. We find them in tier 3 and TST and all these other things that are going on in the school. And then the big question, what do we do? What do we do? And so I appreciate the work. For those of you watching, I had the opportunity to watch Chris at a summit recently where he was able to speak to DYS, which is our Department of Youth Services, and our Child Protective Services, and several other agencies as well, to introduce them to this at least one answer of something we can do. And so what is, first, I guess, what is that answer? Can you define that for us? Can you give us like a 1 minute on it or something?
The answer is hope. So it's interesting that you talk about the fact that we see this play out in adolescence, and according to what I understand from Dr. Perry, that is the second point in a child's life where the brain really is sort of forming extensively. And again, if we're putting all this trauma on top of them, what do we expect other than for it to play out the way that it has for years? And I think a lot of the answer has generally been, when you talk about what you're going to do, you blame the kids, and it's usually preceded by some sentence that starts with the idea of, if you would only, or they would only, right? As if somehow if they would just listen to you, if they would just do this differently, everything would be fine. And I think that's the false pretense that so many people have operated under. And so when I talk about hope, it really is based on this idea of everything that we do as human beings is goal oriented, is goal centered. You wake up in the morning and you go to work on time. That's a goal. You go to school on time. That's a goal. You're trying to pursue your degree. That's a goal. Everything we do is a goal. And we struggle, though, when we don't understand the pathways to reach our goals.
Yes.
which is the second tenet. And then we struggle to develop or keep our motivation or our willpower focused when we're trying to attain those goals. And I think for kids, a lot of times it's, again, generalizations, but they probably haven't thought through their goals. They're not sure what their goals really are. Nobody's encouraged them to think about their goals and try to come up with something. Or adults tend to minimize their goals.
Yes.
Right? A kid wants to say, "I want to play in the NBA." Okay, that's good, but you're never going to be good enough, right? And all of a sudden, you just undercut them. So why not think about helping them walk through? Well, what does it take to play in the NBA? And then maybe get it to a point where they can say, okay, so I need to go to school in order to get on a team, in order to be discovered. Okay, now you've helped them do something that is good, and it's not your desire. It's not your responsibility to opine on goals. But then, how do they get the motivation to do it? Right. So we're excited about this potential new goal, but the pathways aren't clear. And all of a sudden, what is a goal really becomes the wish, and we can't deal in wishes. That's not going to get us anywhere. And
so what separates the hope from a wish? Because I know vocabulary matters here.
It does.
And so very, very often, if I lean back on where I grew up, I would say hope, and I would naturally equate that to wish. And that really isn't it.
It's not. And Dr. Hellman defines it this way. Hope is a belief that your future will be brighter or better than today, and that you have the power to make it so. And that's different from optimism, because optimism really is that first phrase. You have the power. Your future will be better than today. Well, we all hope that. We all, that's my wish. But optimism is really that outward focus. It depends on how other people treat me. It depends on what the world does. It depends on something good going my way. It depends if karma is in my corner, right? But hope transfers that to an internal aspect. Now I have control over it, right? So it's not optimism. It's not positive thinking. It's not just resilience. Those are things that are important. But hope really is this framework that you can say, okay, if I've got my goals, if I have identified pathway and I understand what it takes to motivate, then I can put all three of those together. Yes. And that's what I was saying earlier, is that most time we have one or two of those pieces, and particularly with kids, right? The kids haven't thought through what all three of those areas are.
Right.
And so they don't know where to go. They don't know really what to do. And that's where I think we can make the difference, is actually sitting down. And I talk with people and said, you actually got to get a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil out, right? And let's write this out, because all of a sudden you're taking some concrete actions. And I talk about it sometimes, people think it's too simplistic. And I say, no, it's simple, which is different than simplistic, right? It doesn't need to be hard. What it needs to be is usable. And that's what this definition, this framework is. It's usable, because it talks about our goals. It talks about our pathways. It talks about our willpower. It's not simplistic as in it's just some cheap, pop psychology throwaway.
Yeah. Well, I think I would even go back to something that you mentioned a few minutes ago when you were identifying goals. And so I think what you've just defined hope as, the goal setting, the pathway, and the willpower. But when we go back to those goals, and you were talking about people being dismissive, I think as a person who works in human service, that also we have to be careful about projecting goals onto our kids. And then maybe even recognizing you're using the NBA, which I think is an incredible, especially here, into March and March Madness. But I think that's an incredible example, because while we can use that goal of NBA and we can have these metrics and measurables all along the way, if we are wise, then we can also recognize that those metrics and measurable are beneficial, even if they don't make it to the NBA.
Right.
So maturation could naturally give them an off ramp to something else. Goal changes are okay, and we can recognize that.
You summarize that very well. And I think that is part of the problem. We want to project our goals onto someone else, particularly a child, because we as adults think we know better. And it's like, okay, it's my goal for you. And then you get a child who's in trouble, right? And so now we've got our program. Here's my program. Here's the checklist I have been given to make sure you do. And we wonder, well, why don't kids or even adults complete our programs with a higher rate of success? Well, it's because it's your goal, not their goal.
In our program, not theirs.
That's right. And so the challenge there is, how do you help the person you're dealing with sort of come to the realization or the collaboration that your program is a pathway to their goal, right? And I think when we look at it that way, all of a sudden it takes some of the burden off of us as social workers or CPS workers or anybody else, DYS, and say, okay, I can still get what I need to do as part of the court requirements or part of the agency requirements. But when I present it to the individual, I'm helping them see that it's a pathway to their goal, not a contradiction or an opposite goal than what they have. But the first thing you got to do is you got to ask them, what's your goal, right? I remember a great conversation that Judge Hudson had, where, that was the whole deal, trying to get somebody to realize that it was their goal, not our goals. And this young lady said, well, what would you do, Judge Hudson? And he said, well, I might actually start with asking them, what is their goal? and then she paused for a second and said, oh, I guess that might work. And it's really because it's that paradigm shift. We don't think that way naturally, particularly if we've been doing this for a while and all of a sudden, we're a little jaded or we've seen it all. We've been there. And, law enforcement is bad about that, right? We've seen all the problems and everybody's a problem. But it's really kind of shifting to that, what's their goal, not ours, and, how we help them understand the pathways to their goals.
So I think I hear you say that it also, for the person giving hope or the facilitator, that they have a role change as well. So you're no longer a provider, but a facilitator. You're no longer someone trying to plant some seed that's going to, in them, but rather you are someone that's helping them direction. You're giving them agency, I guess, is what we were talking about in the psychology circles.
I think part of that is that, sometimes you have to lend people hope until they have it on their own. Right. Yeah. And I think Dennis Selby, or I forgot his last name, but I think he's credited with saying that. But, you got to find people where they are. Yeah. Right. If they've gone through this idea that somehow they've lost hope, because they've become angry at the system first. Right. I'm being mistreated, that nobody listens to me, et cetera, et cetera. Then they reach to the point where they're at despair because all of a sudden, they don't see any other way to really get around the barriers that are in front of them. What's left for them to do except become apathetic or hopeless about the future? And so if that's the type of person you're dealing with, all of a sudden it's like, look, I'm just looking for a little crack in the door just to kind of get my foot in to then help rebuild, to nurture that hope. And the way you nurture it's you clarify those ideas, what those goals are, you help them understand what the pathways, and if they need to, as you said earlier, re-goal, sort of think about, okay, well, maybe that's not quite going to work, but let's look at it a little bit differently, right? And then find the things that have helped motivate them in the past and continue to help motivate them in the future. All of a sudden you step back up when you've met somebody who's sort of fallen down the stairs.
Well, I think I was reading in one of Munez's articles when he was actually talking about antecedent, hope being an antecedent, and this idea that if we can somehow or another work with individuals and as their hope grows, then it'll actually jump towards conclusion. It actually allows them to view, see, and adjust to future possibilities when obstacles come. And so the idea there is obstacle awareness during those pathways, and be able to say, hey, there is an obstacle. Number one, it's not a dead end. It's just an obstacle. Right. Now let's replot. Let's reframe.
And I think if you're talking with a child, the adolescent, the child is going to have a harder time understanding how to get around that obstacle,
Oh, yeah.
developing multiple pathways. And I think that's where our role as adults, or again, social workers, CPS, or law enforcement, whoever, go, okay, you're not at a dead end, right? Here's how some ideas of getting around it, to again help nurture that motivation, that agency, and that willpower that they need.
So here's a tough question. So we've talked about hope, we've talked about adverse events, but straight up, is hope a mitigating factor against the adverse events or the effects of the events?
A mitigating factor, as in, can it help overcome the
Yes.
adversity?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's countless research articles and studies around that that talk about hope as a protective factor, hope as a buffer against X or against Y, right? It is something that and we've been talking about adolescents, but, you know, for the adults themselves who are working with these adolescents, they need hope too. It's not
Yeah.
like, well, it's just good for somebody else. It's good for all of us, right?
Yeah.
And so when we understand and work, have that framework for ourselves in our own lives, then we build our own hope. And since hope is a social condition, we then can give hope to others. But if you don't have hope yourself, you can't give it.
I love one of the studies you sent me, or I saw in one of your presentations, that talks about those who are administering this style of framework or working inside this framework are showing lower levels of burnout, lower levels of job change, so there is beneficial factor for the facilitator.
Absolutely.
So that they can keep doing this, that maybe they don't get into the cycle.
And they've done this study with people who are currently in a state of homelessness, right? Some of the people that we think might have some of the biggest challenges in life. They've demonstrated how hope can help them with their goals and achieving their goals. Particularly though, if there's a condition to it, is they need that social support system, right? Not the social welfare system is not what we're talking, the social support. How can we sort of surround them and give them support to help bolster their hopefulness? But individuals, you know, who have been victims in domestic violence, or I think they've done a study about pediatricians who've actually encountered kids with trauma a lot, right? And so how does hope help them? So at the end of the day, like I said, hope is for everybody, and hope can benefit everybody. But particularly the work that Dr. Hellman's doing now, and that I'm starting to do a little bit of, is around this idea of burnout, which is particularly related to our resources and demands. And so for individuals who are engaged in doing this work, you know, you basically, in your job, you have resources and you have demands. And the demands are the fact that I don't have a lot of resources. The demands are, you know, the bureaucratic system. The demands, you know, deal a lot with the exhaustion I'm facing and the issues I'm struggling with, the overburdens, right? My supervisor can be a demand instead of being a help to me. He or she's a hindrance, right? So you have all these demands that cause stress that, if not dealt with, will lead to burnout. On the other hand, if you have resources, personal and organizational resources, then those things can counterbalance the demands. And if you have enough resources over demands, that's when you're excelling in your performance, and you're happy to be there, and you show up with vigor and excitement, right? Even in professions that are not known for that. In fact, that model I just described was created by some researchers who looked at human services first, right? They're looking at people who deal with trauma, who deal with some of the more struggling and stressful events in professions. And they said, here's how it works. And all of a sudden it's like, yeah, I see that's how it works. And so for me, that's been a good model to say, look, what we're trying for, and I guess I'll make sure I say this, is we're not just trying to build hope for hope's sake, right? The goal is not just more hope. The goal of implementing hope is increased well-being. Right. That's what we want for it. So the kids who are struggling with adversity because of adverse childhood events, the adolescents who struggle with that, the adults who find themselves struggling because of stress and anxiety and so forth. We're not just trying to increase hope score. What we're trying to do is increase your level of well-being. And the only way to really do that, or the best way to do that, is through hope. And because hope has this structure of goals, pathways, and willpower, you can actually measure it. So you can see, is hope increasing? Is well-being increasing? Otherwise, like I said, it's just a wish. You just kind of, well, I just hope things get better, you know?
Yeah. I think of the in the adolescent phase, and my wife taught me something years ago, and her work is in education, and she does a lot of work in behavioral with kids, and she has an axiom that she pulled from a class years ago, and it's just been something, but it's model the behavior you want to see. And in my counseling work, that is something that I have picked up. I tell parents all the time, model the behavior you want to see. And so it's very reassuring to hear you describe. So if I am a teacher, if I'm a social worker, if I am this, and I began to envelop this particular framework, I clearly set goals, I clearly walk pathways, I celebrate willpower, I do something to keep willpower and agency going, then those around me also tend to mimic that because of you model the behavior you want to see.
Right.
It's scaffolding 101, over and over again as we teach our kids. I think last night we were texting back and forth, and I had sent you a quote, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but it was this idea that trust and there was this general understanding of hope as well, has proven to be actually more important to address even before the effects of the abuse or the effects of substance use or any of the childhood. So if a adolescent comes to us, if we're working with an adolescent, what research seems to be panning out is that there is at least a conversation going on that it could be more important to establish trust, rapport, and hope before we even address these others. Is this something that you're seeing pan out as well?
Yeah, I think at the heart of every relationship is trust, right? And my relationship with you, who I know a little bit better today than I did a month ago, my relationship with, someone who I've never met, but maybe meet them for the first time, and everything we do has a relationship at some level, and it's based on trust. And the idea around trust is that it incorporates two things: vulnerability and risk. Our willingness to be vulnerable and accept the risk that people won't do what they say they're going to do, or won't follow through, or maybe mistreat us, right? And so when we're willing to do that, engage in vulnerability and accept risk, then we are engaging in trusting behavior. But it takes a while, right? And so we might see each other and have a little bit of trust, and then we're either going to increase our trust or we're going to decrease it. And we all know from, I presume we do, from personal relationships where we violated that trust, and we've seen all of a sudden a good relationship gone bad. And so again, in this context, if you're dealing with a child or an individual who has no reason to trust you because every other human being in their life has violated their trust. And now that you expect, because you're the social worker or you're the teacher, that somehow they're just naturally going to trust you. You can't. I mean, I wish I could even say it more strongly, but you can't come into that conversation thinking that, right? You have to, as you said, build that trust. And so we're either building trust, we're spending or using the trust we've created, or we're breaking that trust.
Collateral,
and so we need to be focused on building it. And I'm convinced, again, that when we demonstrate, as you said, because we've modeled this behavior, that understanding the framework of goals, pathways, and agency, and that will help them build that trust. What it doesn't do is guarantee success, right? So it's just not one of those frameworks that says, well, if you just do this, you're guaranteed to succeed. No, what you're guaranteed to do is continue to keep trying. The proverbial, I don't guess it's apocryphal, I've seen it too many places, but the Thomas Edison, I found 10,000 ways the light bulb doesn't work until I found the one, right? And so if hope was based on success, then after I failed about 15 times, I just give up, because then I don't want to do it anymore. It's too hard. It's too difficult. I won't accomplish it.
Run out of pathways.
Run out of willpower. Exactly. But if we understand hope is not about building success, it's about building hope, then when we run into the failures, it's okay because we still see how it goes toward the goal we're trying to create and
Yeah.
trying to work towards. And so all of a sudden, maybe failures are less frequent or less often. But when we realize that I've been hopeful, and hope has led to some success, and I've seen the challenges I've had to overcome, then the next time we're faced with a challenge, we can look back at where we've been successful, where we've accomplished our goal, and realize, okay, I've done that before. That builds hope in me to accomplish and address this
like
new
a future
concern.
memory. Yeah.
You're creating future memories, right? Well, how do you create future memories? Well, obviously, I'm not, psychic to see this memory. What I'm doing is creating that feeling of what it felt like, right? If you graduated from college, let me just put it this way: if you graduated from high school, you know what that felt like. And somebody says, you want to go to college? I don't know if I can go to college. Well, have you ever struggled, and overcome? Yeah, well, I got through high school. Well, how'd that feel? Felt great. Well, imagine how that's going to feel when you actually graduate from college and you've accomplished that goal. Oh yeah, I see that, right? You see the walking across the stage, and you can see everybody cheering for you, and you're creating that future memory so that when you do accomplish that goal and walk across the stage, it's almost like it's not the first time, because in your head you've seen that.
Yeah.
And it's the imagination that comes from being hopeful and understanding how hope works that lets you create that future memory.
There's beautiful things. If we're not careful, we'll go on all day.
Yeah.
Both of us love to talk about this particular issue because I think we see the possibilities of success, and
Right.
and I think it's awesome. I'd love for you to be able to just give them, information, maybe how to get in touch with the Hope Research Center. Like, where do they go to get more information about that? Where do they go to get more information about you? I think that would be good information as we start winding down a little bit.
So there's a couple of things. One is actually in Mississippi, the Hope Rising Mississippi .org. It's hoperisingms.org. You can actually go to our website, and there's a little information there. My website, if you just Google Christopher Freeze, FBI or something, you'll probably see a link to mine. Mine is mrchrisfreeze.com is my website. But I would encourage everybody to read Dr. Hellman's book, Hope Rising, How the Science of Hope Can Change Your Life. And it's obviously on Amazon, and you can find a copy there. And that actually does incorporate the adverse childhood experiences and other issues of traumas, and talk about how hope has played out in people's lives and how to nurture that hope. And so I think just doing that is a good resource to begin with.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I appreciate you greatly, more than you know. And thank you very much for sharing this time with the class and with other individuals that may watch our Zoom for a little while. I just appreciate you. Wish you luck as you start researching this. I can't wait to hear what comes next. And I really can't wait to start watching you sort of gel up what's going to happen on your dissertation. So
yeah, me too.
I was about to say, I bet you're hoping the same thing. So thank you very much. And I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, John.
All right. Bye-bye.